In January 2015, Life is Strange was released by indie game development and publishing company Donod. It became an instant hit, amassing 3 million sales in 3 years, and later surpassing 8 million sales as of 2023. I recently replayed Life is Strange 2, and Captain Spirit, and I noticed a reoccurring structure that Donod uses throughout those stories. Rather than immediately introducing their supernatural elements, Donod first establishes a grounded and familiar reality, using everyday life as a foundation before disrupting that reality with extraordinary events. Life is Strange opens with a flash of a wild storm, with our protagonist lying on the ground. As Max gets up and looks around, we see a massive tornado approaching a distant town. Immediately, the player is given a sense that this story has high stakes: a disaster, a mystery, a town being destroyed. But then we suddenly transition to a classroom. Max is sitting in a photography lesson. This abrupt shift from an apocalyptic scenario to an ordinary classroom creates a contrast between the extraordinary and the familiar. Despite the massive implications of the opening storm, the player's attention is redirected towards everyday concerns of high school. I think the school section does a few things. Firstly, it introduces the main setting and world that Life is Strange is creating: school, teenagers, and the social dynamics surrounding them. Secondly, it establishes the characters who will drive the narrative: Victoria, the competitive class rival; Kate, the quiet and isolated classmate; Jefferson, the popular teacher; and Max, the introverted and grounded protagonist. More importantly, this sequence establishes the game's initial genre identity. At a glance, Life is Strange presents itself as a coming-of-age story, focused on friendships, identity, school conflicts, and personal struggles. Donod intentionally creates a recognizable teenage environment because this familiarity allows the later supernatural elements to feel more disruptive. The opening scenes push us into a classic coming-of-age atmosphere. We deal with Victoria's comments, walk through the halls as Max with music playing in our headphones, and explore the details of Blackwell Academy. Maybe you read Max's journal entries, which introduces her conflict of returning to her hometown while pursuing photography. Maybe you listen to Max's thoughts about her classmates, or examine the posters and objects scattered throughout the school. Maybe you even find yourself wondering, who is Rachel Amber, and where did she go? The important thing is that the player initially understands Max as a normal teenager living a mostly normal life, dealing with small-town problems and a complicated high school environment. Donod constructs an archetypal high school setting before deliberately subverting it. The game asks the player to settle into a familiar narrative framework before revealing that this is not a story about just teenage life, but a supernatural mystery built around those same everyday experiences. And then comes the bathroom scene. This is where everything changes. A student with a gun kills a blue-haired girl, and Max rewinds time for the first time. The scene is shocking, sudden, and completely changes the player's understanding of the story. The bathroom sequence functions as the narrative catalyst, the moment where the established reality of the story is disrupted and the true nature of the conflict begins to emerge. Suddenly, Life is Strange is no longer a story about a teenager navigating friendships in high school. We remember the storm from the opening scene and begin to understand that the supernatural elements were present all along. Because that's what Life is Strange is: a coming-of-age story combined with supernatural thriller. The game does not abandon its grounded teenage setting when introducing supernatural elements. Instead, it uses that setting as the emotional foundation for the larger conflict. Just like the opening itself, the game constantly exists between the small and the large. A high school in a small town contains ordinary problems, but those problems exist alongside stakes that feel much larger than the characters initially understand. This contrast between personal struggles and larger consequences is what makes the opening effective. Donod begins with the familiar, before introducing the impossible, allowing the player to experience the same gradual realization as Max herself. Captain Spirit, the short free-to-play game released before Life is Strange 2, follows a similar narrative structure. The game begins with Chris playing in his room, immediately establishing his creativity and imagination as he creates his superhero persona. Here's a fake out scene at the start of the game hinting at powers. I think Don't Nod knows that we expect supernatural abilities, and if this were a full Life is Strange game, then this scene would be a perfect setup hint, under the same category as the Storm Dream or the police cam footage, which I'll get to later. The player explores Chris's vibrant bedroom while listening to his cheerful commentary, and he is eventually called downstairs for breakfast by his father. However, once the player leaves Chris's room, the environment changes dramatically. This transition from imagination to reality is one of the most important uses of contrast in Captain Spirit. The game initially presents itself through the perspective of a child fantasy, creating the sense of adventure and innocence. However, the player gradually begins to recognize that this fantasy is not simply a playful addition to the story, but a way to process the difficult reality surrounding him. In a way, Captain Spirit's opening scene mirrors Life is Strange. It hints at a possible supernatural element, for Chris being superhero powers, before grounding us in a bleak reality. If you take too long to leave Chris's room, his father responds with frustration. He grabs a beer, comments on Chris's bruised arm, and through his reaction, you can tell that he was the one that caused it. The player begins to understand the implication that Chris's home life is far more complicated than it first appeared. For the majority of Captain Spirit, Chris moves from task to task, entertaining himself with imaginary villains, such as the snowman outside or the water eater. On the surface, these moments resemble a traditional adventure game, filled with exploration and childhood creativity. However, Don't Nod once again subverts expectations, going against the archetype with a much darker narrative. Captain Spirit uses the conventions of a childhood fantasy to frame a story about trauma. Chris's superhero persona does not remove him from his problems, and instead becomes the language through which he understands and escapes them. The game's emotional impact comes from the gap between Chris's interpretation of events and the player's growing awareness of what is happening. By the end of the game, we reach the catalyst. Chris's father wakes up and lashes out at him, causing Chris to run towards the treehouse. After he falls, a mysterious force prevents him from hitting the ground. For players who experience Captain Spirit before Life is Strange 2, this moment functions similarly to Max discovering her powers. An ordinary character, living through ordinary struggles, is suddenly introduced to something supernatural. The supernatural element does not appear randomly, it emerges at the most intense moment, at a catalyst. Similar to Life is Strange, the supernatural acts as a turning point that transforms a grounded personal story into something larger. To me, Captain Spirit feels like the beginning of a classic Life is Strange narrative. Across these stories, Don't Nod repeatedly follows a similar formula. Establish a charming and familiar world, introduce subtle signs of conflict, and then use a catalyst to reveal the supernatural element beneath the surface. Life is Strange 2. Arguably the best one in the series, but, it's debatable. Life is Strange 2 begins with Sean Diaz, his father, and his younger brother Daniel. Unlike Max's introduction, which focuses on school and identity, Life is Strange 2 begins by emphasizing family relationships. Sean is introduced as the typical older sibling and teenager, his father as a caring and humorous parent, and Daniel as the younger brother who can be frustrating, but still clearly loved. I also wanted to note here, I forgot to add, Life is Strange 2 actually does open with a hint at Daniel's powers, with the police cam footage. I think this just further emphasizes the same kind of formula or structure that Don't Nod will follow, where it kind of hints at the possible supernatural element, the storm, Chris's superhero toys, and Daniel's powers, before going into the ordinary familiar lifestyle and then the extreme catalyst. Yeah. Just like Life is Strange, before the story introduces its larger conflict, Don't Nod spends time creating an emotional foundation between its characters. Within this opening, the player begins to notice small details that suggest where the story is heading. Their father's desire to travel to Mexico, Sean and Daniel's slightly strained relationship, and the emphasis on family all act as early narrative seeds. At this point, the player does not yet understand the full significance of these details. They simply register as aspects of an ordinary family story. And then, of course, comes the catalyst. The situation escalates rapidly. Suddenly, Daniel is injured, a police officer shoots Sean's father, and the entire structure of their lives collapses within moments. The effectiveness of this scene comes from the contrast between its placement and its intensity. The player has only just become comfortable with the ordinary rhythm of their family life before it's ripped away. At the highest point of tension, these ordinary characters are pulled into another supernatural conflict. Across Life is Strange, Captain Spirit, and Life is Strange 2, Don't Nod repeatedly uses the same narrative structure. A grounded introduction, subtle hints, or not so subtle hints, of darker themes, and a catalyst that reveals the supernatural elements hidden beneath everyday life. These calm before the storm moments are really important at setting up the narrative themes of each game, and they have always stood out as something that Don't Nod excels at. The Life is Strange games do many things right, and as always, there's a million more things I could talk about, but for now, that's it from me. Stay safe, talk to you later, bye.